Brandi. Hang on. There you go.
Yes.
All right. Here we go.
So I see recording. I see the, there we go.
Okay. Nikki, I can only see, because I'm sharing my screen, like 4 people, so I don't know when there's enough people to get started, so you just let me know.
We have about 8 or 9, so I think.
Oh, wow.
I think you're good to, get started. I'm sure
We'll give them 1 more minute till 11:05.
That's beautiful. I love it.
Okay, Brandi, I can't see me.
We see you clearly.
We see you clearly, Chuck. You're good.
Okay. All right.
I'll let you know when to start here. And I'll introduce you. Nikki, can you mute everybody except for me and Chuck?
I got you.
All right, everyone, we're going to give it just. Okay, everyone, we're going to give it just 1 more minute exactly, and then we'll get started.
I did ask Chuck to unmute himself. So Chuck, if you hear me, I'm asking you to unmute. So you probably have to, there you go.
There you go.
You got it. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, and we should be good to go. Remember, guys, just, again, classic Zoom rules. I am giving you the option to unmute yourself because I have a handyman in the building and I have to run back and forth today.
Okay.
So I'm going to let you guys unmute yourselves, but be nice to Brandi and Chuck, and mute yourself again once you are done talking or whatnot. If you have a question, try to use the chat as much as you possibly can.
All righty. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our special guest. My name is Brandi Zamora with Fidelity National Home Warranty and Disclosure Source, NHD. I know you guys know me a little more for the home warranty, but you do NHD as well, and we have an excellent NHD company. So I have a very special guest who speaks from coast to coast, our regional vice president, Chuck, and he's gonna just go over the basics, but he's also gonna do a great question and answer session. And then if we could fit in any home warranty stuff at the end, we will do that as well. So without further ado, Chuck Piro.
Good morning, everybody. And I appreciate everybody being part of our little meeting this morning. And I think that this was set up as an NHD training. So we will keep this rather basic, but let me start with exactly kind of the roots of the industry and why we do what we do. And this goes back a few decades, back in the 70s, when a piece of property was sold and the seller and the agent did not disclose to the buyer that the property was in a landslide area and that the home had suffered some damage as a result of the landslide. So the house was sold without the buyer's awareness of this problem. Of course, they found out from a neighbor that the problems existed on the property. And to make a long story short, the seller and the seller's agent were found guilty of non-disclosure, and they had to pay a lot of money to get this property fixed. So over the years, politicians began to realize that there were maps that were available both at the federal level and the state level that would show properties that are in these designated hazard zones. And the hazard zones were flood zones, fire zones, and earthquake zones, and landslide zones. So in 1998, in June of 1998, it became mandatory for sellers and their agents to disclose if properties were in any of these zones prior to somebody purchasing a house. Now, I say that specifically so that you understand that the liability attached to natural hazard disclosures is not just the seller's liability, it is the seller's agent's liability as well. So an agent's just on the hook for non-disclosure just as much as the seller is. And I would probably say even more so, because sellers don't know about this stuff. Sellers use real estate agents to take them through the process of purchasing a home in a litigious industry, in a litigious state, so that at the close of this transaction, they're not exposed to liability. Now, I'll tell you right now, sellers don't care about the price of the report. They care about being protected, and they care about agents making the right decisions to protect their liability. So I know that when I talk about natural hazards disclosure, I try to do so by giving a voice to the seller, because the seller's the person that A, is on the hook for liability, B, he pays for the report, but he never gets a choice. He just goes with what the agent wants to use. And how often over the last over 20 years have I heard agents say, when asked, what NHD report do you get? It is, I don't care, I just get the cheap one. And it's really alarming to me that I think that sellers in the long run aren't having their best interest served by agents that don't exercise due diligence when they select a natural hazard disclosure company. And to complicate that decision even more is the fact that the natural hazard disclosure industry, since the day it started in June of 1998, is not a regulated industry. It's a non-regulated industry. And that very much complicates, excuse me, there I am. That very much complicates this entire process, is the fact that this industry is not regulated. And what does that mean to you? What's non-regulation mean to sellers of real estate and the agents that represent the sellers? It means that anybody, whether they're qualified or not, can open up a natural hazard disclosure company and start selling you reports. And I can tell you without question and 100% factual that the natural hazard disclosures industry is largely comprised of non-qualified entrepreneurs that purchase data from data providers and then forward that information to you via a report, a natural hazard disclosure report. Now, what's bad about that is that if these entrepreneurs aren't responsible because they didn't do the research, they bought it from somebody else, then they disclaim it in the terms and conditions. And they'll tell you things that you don't want to hear. So to me, the most important pages of an NHD report aren't whether or not the property is in a zone or not. It's what happens if they make a mistake. So we'll talk about that in a little while. So let's just get to the basics of an NHD report. So go to that second slide, Brandi. What our report does is that we provide you with the legally required disclosures that are stated in California's Civil Code. And the one thing that we don't do, that a lot of our competitors do, is we don't add selective, worthless, non-essential disclosures. Now, some companies will add disclosures that aren't required of the seller. Now, if I'm a seller, or if you're a seller, put yourself in the seller's position. Do you want a company adding a bunch of stuff to your report that you don't need to disclose? And I think the answer is absolutely not, because every time there is a disclosure on one of these reports, if you think about the process that's going through the buyer's mind, if a buyer looks at a natural hazard disclosure report and they start looking at it and they're going, okay, well, the property's in a flood zone. Do we want to continue with the purchase of this house? Or, oh, the property's in a landslide zone. Do we want to continue purchasing this house? Why would you want to add more disclosures to that process rather than just keeping it the way it's supposed to be? And our company just discloses what is legally required of you as an agent and of the seller. Because when you add subjective disclosures, I think the bigger question becomes, where do you stop adding subjective disclosures? It's not your job to disclose things that aren't required. So it's a dangerous road to go down when you start disclosing things you're not supposed to disclose. And we have some of our competitors that add 20 things onto a report that aren't required. So our company just discloses what is legally required. Okay, the next slide. We have in our industry the highest amount of errors and omissions insurance that protects not only you and your client, but also protects us as a company. So every report that's produced by our company is protected with $60 million of errors and omissions insurance. And that's really because we're part of a Fortune 500 organization or company. There's only one other company in our space that can make that claim. Okay, so we're part of a Fortune 500 company. And I would just say with that, the number one reason why agents and sellers use natural hazard disclosure companies is to protect their liability. So with that as a foundation of why you use an NHD company, who would you rather have in your corner or in your court fighting for you? You want a Fortune 500 company, or do you want an unqualified entrepreneur? I think the obvious answer, is going to be Fortune 500 company, no doubt. Okay, the next slide. Speaking about our errors and omissions insurance, our slide protects all parties in a transaction, not only you and your client, but we also protect the broker and the escrow and the transaction coordinator. So anybody that's attached to liability would be protected under that. Skip that next slide, Brandi, and go to the geologist on staff. And we have a gentleman by the name of Jeff Asbury. Jeff's got over 30 years of experience in this industry. That's responsible for the production of our reports. Why is this important to you and your seller? Because the civil code states that a third party report must be produced by a qualified professional, and that's a licensed geologist. And I think that we are one of only two companies. Think about that. We are one of only two companies that have a qualified professional as part of our staff. And that's very important to you. For that reason, it is a mandated qualification. Number two, there's no better person to provide any kind of background or answer your questions about this stuff than a guy like Jeff. Okay. Which is the next slide, which is consultation. That's the word I was looking for. So if you need consultation, and who's going to need consultation? This is something we do like all the time, is consult with buyers and sellers about stuff on the report. And it's kind of a never ending job for me in particular. Because if you have a problem with you have a question about your report, or your client has a question about the report, that typically gets filtered to me, and I can answer all those questions for you. Okay, the next slide. In our report, we have embedded links. So that means like the earthquake book and the earthquake safety guide and the protection from lead, all of that stuff is embedded in the report, so that when you email this report to your clients, all they have to do is click a link on the report and it'll take them to those publications. Okay, the next slide is just the ease of ordering online. We try to make it easy for you. I don't know how many of you folks order yourself or you have escrow order it, but I would pause and I would say that the best time to order a natural hazard disclosure report is when you take the listing. That way you could review the report, and if there's any questions that you have before a buyer comes in, you could have those questions answered before the process begins. You don't get charged for the report unless and until escrow closes. So you can always order it up front without fear of having to pay for it if the deal doesn't close, okay? Next one is a quick turnaround time, and typically I remember in the early days of selling these reports, it took like a week to get the report. Now it takes minutes to get the report. So if you need the report, typically, I think what our tag is, you get it within an hour, but I think typically you get it a lot quicker than that. Only sometimes.
Sometimes you
would
get
it
it in
be-
like 20 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Skip that next slide and let's go to the fact that we are a Fortune 500 company. We really already discussed that. And then let's go to what the features of the report are, and that's going to be the 2 slides more. Okay, so the first feature that we have, and click that next slide. There you go, Brandi. One of the best features I think that we have on our product are our maps. Now, of course, the maps that are on the report aren't the maps that we research. These are just tools that we provide for you as the seller's agent to show a potential client the subject property in relationship to the zone that it might be in. And as you can see on this slide, on the one on the left is the entire page. And this property happens to be in what would be considered to be a supplemental seismic geologic hazard zone. What that means, it's in probably a landslide zone. And the purpose of and the benefit of having the map is that this shows the buyer that it's not just the subject property that's in this zone. It is this entire area. So if they were to go, in this particular case, if they were to go to a mile in any direction of the subject property to look at a different house, the same determination would be made. So this entire area on this map is in a supplemental geologic hazard zone, which means, again, landslides, liquefaction. There's a whole lot of things that fall under the heading of seismic geologic hazard zones. But without a map, and a lot of our competitors don't have maps on their reports, without a map, you have no perspective. The buyer has no perspective as to how big this zone is. Without a map, they could assume, wow, no wonder these people are selling this house. It's probably the only one that's going to be in a landslide area. That's just not the case. You can see that the zones are large areas that kind of take the stigma away from the house. Okay, the next slide. This is just a convenience that with our report, there's only one signature page. Now, some agents may wish to have their buyers' initial pages as they go through the report, so they could be sure that they understand what each page means. But in terms of legality, there's only one place to sign on the report, and that's going to be this page, which is called the Natural Hazard Disclosure Statement. And who signs this statement? The seller, the seller's agent, and the buyer. The buyer's agent doesn't sign the Natural Hazard Disclosure Statement. This is a question that gets asked all the time. Where does the buyer's agent sign? There's no place for the buyer's agent to sign on this document because the buyer's agent's only responsibility in terms of this report is to deliver it to their client. The seller and the seller's agent sign it because it's their disclosure to be made. However, they're signing saying that they've used a third party and they don't know that anything is different than what the third party says. The buyer signs it acknowledging receipt of the report, and that's all. Okay, the next page. When you go through the report, each page will give you a little paragraph about the zone that we're talking about. So if you want to know about a flood zone, there's going to be a little paragraph that's created in a user-friendly format to let the client know what a flood zone is, what a potential flood zone is, what a very high fire hazard severity zone is. So each of the zones, there's a little description of it so that the people will kind of know what's going on. Okay, the next page. This is a really good page when you look at this on a computer, because I think about 3 or 4 pages into the report, you're going to find a summary page. So the summary page will give you a summary of every disclosure that's made on the report. So we're going to have all of the mandatory disclosures. We're going to have all of the supplementary disclosures, which are locally identified hazard zones. Then there's other mandatory disclosures like airport influence areas, airport proximity areas, right to farm areas. And we'll let you know on that summary page whether the property is in or out of those zones. And if you were to use your mouse and click on any one of these, it'll take you right to the page in the report that'll give you a description of what those zones are. Okay, the next page. Next page is really important because this is really an area of the report that some companies do not give you, and that is locally identified hazard zones. Now, there are state maps, there are federal maps, and there's also local maps. And each of these sources of information give you additional data about the subject property. So without local maps, a property could be located in a landslide zone, and the state would say map not yet released by the state. And I think if you've ever read a disclosure report, you will have noticed that that's one of the checkoff boxes is it in a zone? Yes, no, information not available from the state. And a lot of times when you get to that state level stuff, it'll say no information available. That doesn't mean that the city hasn't done something or the county hasn't done something to map those areas, and oftentimes they have. So when you look at the maps, there's going to be 2 maps in our report. One of them is going to be about state and federal information. The second map is going to be locally identified hazard zones. And if you wonder why they look different, it's because local agencies have more data than state agencies when it comes to your county. So it's really important that natural hazard disclosure companies include this data, because if it's not included, you're going to have an incomplete report and you're going to have information that's not put on here that's publicly available. So everything that's we put into this report, there's nothing proprietary about what we do. We just look at all of the available maps where other companies don't. And that's crucial to your client's liability and to your liability as well. Okay? Now, the next slide. Now, we talked about adding things to the report, and some companies, like I said, add as many as 20 additional disclosures. Disclosures carry liability, and you don't want to do that. However, there are things that could be important and relevant to the sale of property. So what we have done, and this is based on law, number 1, and number 2 would be common sense, that we add advisories into our report instead of disclosures. And I'll give you an example of what an advisory is. This is a mandatory advisory, the one I'm going to talk about right now. So one of the things you have to disclose in the report, which you have to provide, is a link to the Megan's Law website. So you as an agent, if in your farm, how would you know if a sexual offender lived in that area? You would have to go to the Megan's Law website and you would have to look to see. And I'm sure your broker or your manager, and if they haven't, I'll tell you right now, that's not information that you need to know. So when it comes to sexual offenders in the neighborhood, you might have a discussion that might go something like this with your buyer. Hey, by the way, there are sex offenders throughout California, And if you want more information about the location of sexual offenders, here's a website that you can go look at, and it's meganslaw.ca.gov. Okay, that's an advisory. By providing a website for sex offenders, what you're doing is you're taking the liability away from yourself and of the seller and placing the responsibility of discovery over to the buyer. If the buyer wants to know, they can go find out. Okay, so that goes to stuff like military ordnance locations and capped gas wells. And there's a lot of relevant things about the sale of property that aren't really disclosures yet, but it's relevant. So what Disclosure Source does is we give you about 4 pages of advisories. And what the advisory does is that it highlights these areas without disclosing them, and it allows the buyer to go search for them themselves. So we give you a lot of links that will help the buyer go discover this stuff if they're interested in any of these things. Okay. Next page. And we'll when I'm done with this little thing, we'll go back and we'll open up your mics and you can ask questions. The next part of the report I'm going to talk about are special taxes and assessments. So I'll tell you, after 22 years in this industry, and Brandi had mentioned coast to coast, actually it's border to border for California because natural hazard disclosure is just a California requirement. But nonetheless, I've traveled throughout the state giving presentations in boards and associations, and literally I've been in thousands of real estate offices and spoken to so many agents. And one of the things I always like to ask is, do you sell property in Melrose districts? And most of the time people say yes. So then my question becomes, do you know how to disclose if a property's in a Melrose district? Or do you depend on your natural hazard disclosure company to make that disclosure for you? And the answer always is, no, I don't know how to do it. I rely on my NHD company to do that. So the problem with that little scenario is this. If you don't know how to disclose Melrose, how would you know if your natural hazard disclosure provider does it for you properly? And without government regulations in place, these guys can put anything they want in these reports. You know, we have a competitor that in their terms and conditions, it says, as clear as you can read it, it says this company is not responsible for errors in the tax data that it provides, that they get from third parties. So they go buy the information, they put it on their report, and then they tell you, hey, by the way, if there's a mistake, we're not responsible for it. My question would be, well, if you're not responsible for it, then who is? And why would I buy a report from you if you're not going to take responsibility for what's in the report? So Melrose is a complicated disclosure, but with Disclosure Source, and this is the fact, again, we're a Fortune 500 company with too much to lose. We do things that are in compliance with the law. And by the way, real quickly, if the property's in a Melrose district, what would you want to know about it? You're an agent. Let's say I was selling you a property and I told you that it was in a Melrose district. What would you want to know? And I'm going to just tell you, what you're going to want to know is, how much is this going to cost me per year? So I'm going to tell you it's going to cost you $1,000 a year. Okay. What else do you want to know? Well, I want to know, how long do I have to pay for this? If it's $1,000 a year, how long do I have to pay for it? Because Melrose assessments are a fixed amount of years, typically 25 years, 20, 25 years. If somebody's already lived in the house for 15 years, you don't go back to year one, you pick up from where they left off. So you might only have to pay for the thing for the next 5 or 10 years. You want to know that. So it's $1,000 annually. You're going to have to pay it for the next 5 years. What else do you want to know? Well, can it go up? Yes, sometimes they can double or they can triple or more. So you have to let the buyer know, what's the maximum I'm going to have to pay for this? Number two, or not, I don't know if it's number two, number three, what am I paying for? What's the percentage by which the maximum tax can increase per year? And what's the phone number of the agency that collects the money in case I have any more questions. So there's 6 required disclosures. With Disclosure Source, we give you all of those 6 requirements, okay? Next, one of the things that's been happening for the last few years are these PACE program assessments. And they're under HERO program, Fig Tree, Y Green. There's a lot of programs that allow people to borrow money in order to purchase, say, a solar system on the house, which could cost, say, $30,000. Okay? You need to disclose that to the buyer, that the property is in a property assessed clean energy. It has one of these liens on the house. Because what happens to that lien when that seller sells the house? The lien stays with the house. It doesn't go with the seller. That means the buyer assumes that lien. So this becomes a negotiating situation with the buyer and the seller. Because what happens, how does that thing get paid back, that $30,000? It gets paid back through an increase in their taxes. So this thing that was so wonderful when it started has become an anchor to a lot of agents trying to sell houses that are encumbered with PACE liens. So our report will let you know if the property that you're listing is has a PACE lien on it. Okay, next. Oh, I can see everybody now. Next is an automated supplemental tax estimator. Can you guys see that thing? You got that up, Brandi? Okay. So there's a page on the report that will let you know by way of you just making a couple of clicks in there how much the supplemental property tax amount is going to be. All you do here is you just fill in the amount that you paid for the house, and this little chart will automatically fill itself in. You have to let us know on this page what month it's going to close, and that'll give you the number that you need. You can tell your buyer that you're going to get a supplemental tax bill for X amount of dollars, okay? So that's, in a nutshell, that's our report. That's a little synopsis about the industry, and I'll take questions if anybody has any questions. So you guys can all unmute if Brandi wants to unmute you.
I think Nick has to unmute everyone. Let's
Okay.
check the chat room, see if we, that's Heather to me. Chuck, did you go over already, and you might have, I'm sorry, but the waiving of the benefit, the
2778. Great. Thanks,
2770,
Brandi.
yes.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have that on this little PowerPoint thing that you brought up. Okay, so in the terms and conditions, I had mentioned earlier in this presentation that what I think the most important pages of a natural hazard disclosure report are going to be the terms and conditions page. Because you can't change what the provider says about a property. It's either in a zone or it's not in a zone. And you can't change that. I think the bigger question for an agent, and certainly for the seller, would be, what if this company made a mistake? How are they going to rectify it? What are they going to do if they make a mistake? So you got to look at the terms and conditions, because the terms and conditions will outline what they're going to do. Perhaps you have to go to arbitration in Connecticut, as weird as that sounds. Maybe they won't go to court for you. Maybe they don't even provide you with any liability protection. But one in particular comes to mind because we've seen several companies use this disclaimer. And the disclaimer says this, quote, "The recipients and each of them expressly waive the benefit of California Civil Code 2778. Close quote. Now, I'll tell you that, I don't think that a lot of people actually read these reports. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not pointing my finger at anybody, but generally speaking, what was once a 3-page document is now a 53-page document. And on top of everything else you get in your real estate transaction, who takes time to read a 53-page natural hazard disclosure report? Probably very few people. And if you do read it, you probably only read, is the property in a zone or is it out of a zone? And I think rarely, if ever, do you ever make it back to the very last page of the report. And that's where you would find the phrase, the recipients and each of them expressly waive the benefit of California Civil Code 2778. So let's break this thing apart a little bit. Who are the recipients of the report? Now, I ask this question all the time, and typically the answer is, oh, the buyer. The buyer is not the recipient of the report. The seller and the seller's agent are the recipients of the report. When an NHD company gets an order for a report, we don't know who the seller or we don't know who the buyer is. Our client is going to be the seller and the seller's agent. They're the ones requesting the report. They're the ones who are requesting the liability protection that comes along with using a third party. Okay, so they're the recipients. So now let's look at the statement. The recipients and each of them are going to be the seller and the seller's agent. Okay, expressly waive the benefit. Stop right there. Who waives benefits? Who would waive a benefit? I mean, just think of the word benefit. You know, we like things that benefit us. The word itself is a great word, benefit. Yet this company is saying the recipients, and both of you, expressly waive the benefit. All right, what benefit are you waiving? Of California Civil Code 2778. So A, you don't get to that page of the report. B, you probably don't understand who the recipients are. And C, you're going to waive the benefit of a civil code that few people would ever even look at. So what are you waiving when you waive the benefit of 2778? 2778 confirms the NHD company's obligation to defend you and to pay for that defense. That's the number one reason you use an NHD company, is for liability protection. If they make a mistake, it's not your mistake, it's their mistake. Yet they're telling you through this waiver, hey, we're not going to defend you and we're not going to pay for defense. Again, a consequence of non-regulation. If the industry was regulated, that phrase wouldn't be allowed. That company wouldn't be allowed to be doing business in California. Nobody would waive the benefit of a defense from a company that you contracted to provide a mandatory report. So you got to be real careful and real wise that you read the report and make sure you don't see a disclaimer that says, oh, by the way, we have a cap of $10,000 on our liability, or even a cap of $100,000 on their liability. You guys sell houses probably in your area that have an average of $600,000, $700,000 homes, even $500,000 homes. What's 10 grand going to get you? I won't even pay for the attorney. So this is, again, the consequence of non-regulation is that it allows anybody to open up an NHD company and start selling you reports. They go, hey, I have one for $75. Disclosure source is $99. Why would you spend $25 more when you can get it from me? Believe me, your seller doesn't want bargains. They want liability protection. $25 on a $500,000 transaction is nothing. It's nothing. And that's what sellers are saying. I don't want bargains that jeopardize my liability. I want a rock solid company that I could rely on in the event that there's a mistake on the report. Remember, every agent on this call, you don't spend a penny on the report, not a penny. And it's your liability that's also in danger. So why wouldn't you pick the best company on your client's dime who's not asking you to go get me a deal on an NHD report? Sellers don't ask for deals on any of that stuff. Does the seller ever say to you, hey, see if you can get me a deal on my title policy? that just doesn't happen. Nor do they ask you to get them a deal on their NHD report. They don't even know what an NHD report is. All they want you to do is take them through the transaction so that when it closes, they're not exposed to liability. That's what they want. They don't want you to save $25 because you're buddies with the rep. Your relationship with the rep doesn't mean a darn thing if it comes to litigation, because your rep can't help you. What the legal thing says in the back of the report is what's going to be shown in court. Oh, by the way, didn't you read our waiver of liability? We're not going to court for you. Sorry.
Yep.
Okay.
You guys, we have and you know, just to piggyback on that, I say this in regards to home warranty too. Do not try and save your client money unless they're asking you to save them money, or you will end up costing them money. Okay. I always use my famous story on the side of home warranty as of a time when the agent, who normally doesn't rep people in Palm Springs, advised the buyer not to get AC coverage in Palm Springs on their home warranty. They said, don't worry about it if it breaks down. I got a great AC repairman. And then home warranty, NHD, it's all Murphy's Law. The AC broke down within 2 weeks. It cost them $5,000. So the agent tried to save $80 on a home warranty policy and ended up costing the homeowner $5,000. Do you think they are going to use that agent again? Right? So these aren't places to cut corners. And when it comes to home warranty, when it comes to NHD, I know people are like, oh, you like mom and pop shops and things like that. No, you want a company that can actually pay their claims. And that's what Disclosure Source NHD does. So are there any other questions? I know we went over a bit of a half hour, but we're going to get you out in under an hour if there's not any other questions. Are we good?
Are we good? Okay, everybody, here's what I want you to do. If you have a pencil in front of you, get your pencil out real quickly. My name is Chuck Piro, P as in Paul, I-R-O. My phone number is 619-200-7400. Now, Brandi's your rep, and I am proud to be associated with Brandi. She's a terrific, knowledgeable rep who knows a lot of stuff. But I want to just offer myself to you, and you probably go through Brandi anyway if you have a question. But you can always call me if you have a question about a report. I'm, I think, fairly pretty good at talking to your clients and taking any fear away from the questions that they have. I try to speak in language that they understand. And I'm glad you're on this call. I hope you guys found some value with this. And Brandi, if nobody has a question, I guess I can just leave the rest of this meeting to you.
Yeah, go ahead. Enjoy the mountains, Chuck. Thanks for coming out.
Okay.
Wait, hold on, Chuck, wait. We got a question.
Okay.
Melrose.
Brandi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Aaron. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Chuck. Thanks so much, and Brandi, thanks so much for the presentation.
Sure.
For a new home construction, the sales office basically said with the Melrose that it probably won't expire. And I just was wondering if you'd have any way for me to look that up with either the city or the county to find out more about that for my buyer.
Did you qualify this by saying new construction?
New construction, yeah.
Yeah, new construction is kind of tough, but there are Melrose districts. Hey, look, there's houses that have 6 Melroses on one house, okay? Because they all pay for different things. So one that runs in perpetuity might be a maintenance bond. So that would be the only one I would think of that would run in perpetuity. The other ones are going to be for school districts, or it could be for a flood control channel. It could be for a police department. It could be for any number of things. But the only ones that run in perpetuity are going to be maintenance. And when it comes to new construction, typically those go in phases. So phase one, when somebody buys into phase one, there might only be one Melrose that might be in effect for phase one. But then when they build phase two, that's when they're going to build, say, a high school. Then there's going to be another Melrose that's going to come on top of the first one. So, you know, if you Eric, if you took my phone number down, why don't you give me a call tomorrow, and I can make a phone call for you on that particular project, and we can dig into it a little bit more to see what we can find out.
Okay, Chuck. Yeah, 619-200-7400.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chuck. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
And guys, Chuck is giving you special concierge service here. So sometimes people will read a report and they freak themselves out. Take advantage. You can call Chuck, and he, like he said, knows how to talk them down from the ledge. And sometimes they just like to hear from a regional VP. So it'll help. He's super knowledgeable.
Yeah. People get freaked out. Look at, this is a phone call I would get real quickly before I leave, because I know we're running over. Somebody buys a house and it's in an earthquake fault zone, and they freak out because they're in an earthquake fault zone, and the call comes to me. Hey, Chuck, yeah, I got your number from my agent. I'm getting a house, and I got a report from your company. It says a house in earthquake fault zone, and I'm kind of freaking out about it. What can you tell me? So, hey, I completely understand, your house in earthquake fault zone. Let me ask you a question. Where are you moving here from? The guy might say, I'm moving here from Colorado. Well, hey, welcome to California, because it doesn't matter where you live in California, we are in an earthquake fault zone. And I'll tell you one thing, that earthquake fault zones are only a quarter of a mile wide in width. That's it, quarter mile. Damage as a result of an earthquake doesn't respect the zone. And damage can be done 100 miles away from the epicenter of an earthquake, number one. Number two, what city in California is famous for earthquakes? It's San Francisco. There are zero earthquake fault zones in San Francisco County. So go figure, the fault line goes outside, it runs up San Mateo County and runs out into the ocean. But when it slips, the shaking affects San Francisco County, and they end up with a lot of damage. If you bought a natural hazard disclosure report for any property in San Francisco County, it would never say it's in an earthquake fault zone. How weird is that? So, in another thing, when it comes to earthquake fault zones, typically in a real estate transaction, people have lenders. The buyer puts up 20%, the lender puts up 80%. Who has more skin in the game? The lender. Do lenders require hazard insurance when you live in an earthquake fault zone? The answer is no. They only require flood insurance when you're in a flood zone. They don't require any other hazard insurance. So these are all things, what I'm telling you is, these are all things that are easily explained to a concerned buyer. But let us be your partners in this part of your transaction. You guys, I think that the best agents surround themselves with experts. And I look at this Zoom meeting here today as I'm auditioning to be a part of your team. So if you need us for any part of this report, we're here to help you. And I'm talking about both Brandi and I.